Welcome to the channel. Today we travel back into one of the darkest, most heroic chapters in human history, the Siege of Leningrad. Between 1941 and 1944, a city of more than 3 million souls was surrounded by Nazi armies, cut off from the world and condemned to starve. For 872 days, Leningrad fought a war of hunger, ice, fire, and pure human will. Here, families burned furniture to stay warm. Children carried bread like treasure. Factories kept building tanks while workers collapsed beside their machines. Music echoed through bombed streets. Museums protected priceless art, and soldiers defended frozen trenches against impossible odds. This is not just the story of war. It is the story of people. Mothers burying their children under snow. Workers welding metal with numb fingers. Scientists guarding seeds instead of eating them. Soldiers hearing the city breathing behind them. A whole civilization refusing to surrender. In this series, you will witness how starvation rewired the human mind, how propaganda reshaped belief, how the road of life across Lake Ladoga saved millions, how culture and faith survived when bread did not, how Leningrad rebuilt itself from ashes and frost. The Siege of Leningrad is not just a chapter from World War II. It is a monument to human endurance. It challenges everything we think we know about suffering, loyalty, identity, and courage. So get ready. What you are about to hear is not just history. It is pain, pride, sacrifice, and rebirth told through real lives and real voices. If you're new here, subscribe to History Teller YT, because the past lives again on this channel. Let's begin. Parks became survival centers. The summer garden and field of Mars turned into burial grounds, vegetable plots, and woodcutting areas. Forests near suburban districts were stripped bare, trees cut down and hauled into the city to fuel stoves. Open spaces that once held statues and fountains became firewood stockpiles and snow-melting stations. Children who visited parks before the war now walked past rows of fresh graves, learning to navigate death as part of normal life. Bridges, normally icons of romance, were fortified with anti-aircraft guns, barricades, and sandbags. Some bridges were closed due to artillery range. The frozen Neva River became both border and highway. Soviet soldiers used the ice to transport ammunition, while German artillery targeted anyone crossing it. Crossing the river meant gambling with fate. Shells struck without warning, throwing ice and bodies into the air. Industrial districts were equally transformed. Factories burned night and day, belching smoke that mixed with the scent of starvation, creating a unique smell survivors never forgot. Machine noise was constant, echoing across districts even when workers were too weak to stand. The city's ports, once filled with luxury ships, became military zones full of barges, wrecks, and debris. Every neighborhood held memories of loss. Admiralty District was shelled frequently. Vyborgsky housed starving workers. Petrogradsky Island lost thousands to cold. Moskovsky District saw warehouses destroyed. Each name still holds weight in survivor memories because each area functioned differently under siege. Some produced weapons, some buried the dead, some sheltered children, some fed soldiers, and some became ghost landscapes almost devoid of human footsteps. By the final year of the siege, Leningrad looked like a frozen, scarred continent, not a city. Snow gathered in bomb craters. Walls collapsed in jagged silhouettes. Tram lines lay tangled like skeletons. Yet, alongside ruins stood a sense of sacred defiance. The geography itself became testimony. Streets that once hosted parades were now proof that survival had overcome destruction. The transformation of Leningrad's urban world tells a story beyond tactics and politics. It reveals how space becomes memory and how memory becomes identity. The Neva River, winding like a silver ribbon through the center of Leningrad, became one of the most important and terrifying geographic features of the siege. In peacetime, the Neva was celebrated for its bridges, its shimmering waters reflecting palaces, and its slow summer waves carrying tourists on boats. During the siege, its significance changed entirely. It became a logistical route, a battlefield, a defensive line, and a spiritual symbol. When the river froze in winter, it turned into a natural highway for troops and supplies. Frozen water became more reliable than destroyed roads. Soldiers marched across in temperatures so cold that ice cracked under the weight of artillery. Trucks crossed at night to reduce exposure to German gunners. The Neva resembled a haunted highway, silent except for wind, footsteps, and the distant echoes of shells. Survivors later described the river surface as glowing blue beneath moonlight, a terrifying beauty that haunted their dreams forever. But the Neva also consumed lives. Shells fell constantly, shattering holes in the ice. Anyone near such explosions risked plunging into freezing black water, where survival lasted less than 5 minutes. One witness described seeing an entire horse-drawn sled vaporized in a blast, animal and humans swallowed instantly. Soldiers retrieving frozen bodies sometimes found them twisted into statue-like poses, encased under layers of ice. The river marked the front line between life and death. On its far banks, Soviet soldiers fought German troops positioned only a few hundred meters away. Sniper duels occurred daily, with sharpshooters waiting for opponents to rise from snow trenches. Communications trenches, barely 2 meters deep, zigzagged along the frozen shoreline. Soldiers lived there for months, feet soaked, hands bloody, eyes frozen open. They wrote letters describing how the Neva seemed to whisper, reminding them that the city still lived behind their backs and must not fall. In the spring, thawing ice carried bodies downstream. Civilians standing on bridges saw corpses bumping against broken piers, their uniforms torn, their skin bluish from water and cold. Such sights broke down emotional defenses. Mothers cried for soldiers they had never met. Children stared silently. Police ordered people to turn away, but the river revealed truth daily. Yet the Neva also gave comfort. It remained a constant presence, a reminder that nature continued even when human life fell apart. When spring returned in 1942 and flowing water finally broke through ice layers, people gathered along the banks. They watched the river move and listened to the sound of running water. Many later described this moment as the first time they believed survival was possible. Flowing water meant time passed. Passing time meant change. Change meant hope. The Neva became a symbol of endurance in Soviet memory. Writers compared the river to a backbone holding the city upright. Painters captured its frozen surface beneath artillery bursts. Veterans recalled dipping hands into its icy surface before charging into battle. To Leningraders, the Neva was not merely geography. It was pulse, voice, and prayer. The river linked the city's soul to the world beyond. It witnessed starvation, violence, sacrifice, and still flowed forward. Its existence suggests a truth deeper than strategy. Survival sometimes depends not only on weapons or food, but on symbols powerful enough to keep the spirit alive. Outside Leningrad lay a ring of forests, swamps, lakes, and villages that became one of the largest continuous battle zones of the Eastern Front. These landscapes, once quiet and scenic, turned into killing grounds saturated with artillery, trenches, and unmarked graves. Soldiers fought in brutal conditions, often without shelter, food, or heat. Every meter of soil was soaked with blood, every tree splintered by shells, every path frozen with remnants of conflict. The forests near MGA, Schlisselburg, Pushkin, Kolpino, Uritsk, and Sinyavino became infamous among Soviet troops. Pine trees once filled with summer birdsong became shredded, blackened trunks. Snow mixed with gunpowder residue. Soldiers dug trenches into frozen ground with shovels that snapped under pressure. Some foxholes filled with icy water, forcing men to sleep upright. They fought under constant danger not only from German bullets, but from the weather itself. Villages suffered unspeakable tragedy. Families who had lived for generations in small settlements found their homes burned, livestock slaughtered, barns destroyed. Some fled, others were killed, and many simply disappeared without record. German troops fortified abandoned houses, turning them into sniper posts or ammunition stores. Soviet soldiers, fighting to reclaim these villages, often encountered ruins where living rooms became graveyards and gardens became minefields. The terrain beyond the city influenced supply decisions, troop movement, and survival outcomes. Marshlands froze unevenly. Tanks became trapped in mud. Artillery pieces sank beneath ice. Soldiers described the land as alive, pulling at boots, swallowing horses, gripping wagon wheels like claws. Many bodies were never recovered from swamps. They remain buried beneath forest moss to this day. The deadly perimeter also shaped civilian experience. Bombardment zones reached deep into suburbs, destroying railways and farmland. Before the war, these areas supplied much of Leningrad's food: milk, vegetables, meat. Once occupied or destroyed, they left the city without agricultural support. The siege thus became not only a military blockade, but also a geographical starvation trap. For German forces, the surrounding land created both advantage and failure. While forests provided cover for artillery and observation, their harshness slowed movement and exhausted troops. German soldiers complained constantly about weather, mud, lack of shelter, and endless Soviet counterattacks. Winter transformed German trenches into icy prisons. Summer turned them into mosquito-infested swamps. The frontline perimeter also collided with the emotional lives of soldiers. Soviet troops looked toward the city lights at night and heard faint echoes of music or broadcasts. This experience fueled both longing and rage. Longing to return home, and rage at the enemy who separated them from their families. Some soldiers wrote that they could smell the smoke of city ovens and almost hear the footsteps of loved ones walking through rationed snow. The battlefield beyond Leningrad is a reminder that the siege did not occur only within city walls. It was a living organism stretching across dozens of miles, connecting starving civilians to starving soldiers. Every tree split by shrapnel, every frozen trench, every village burned to ash became part of the city's story. Leningrad's victory was not only urban endurance, it was also rural sacrifice. The surrounding land absorbed horror so the city could breathe. Today, those forests and villages hold monuments, cemeteries, and memorial stones marking where thousands died to defend a city they might never enter again. Their silent landscapes carry whispers of war, still echoing beneath leaves and snow. The winter of 1941 to 42 remains one of the most notorious chapters of the siege, not merely because it was cold, but because cold became a weapon. Nature itself joined the battle, battering Leningrad with temperatures that reached minus 35 degrees Celsius, minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. These were not ordinary winter days. These were nights where frost crept through brick, mortar, clothing, and flesh. When survivors later described their memories, they rarely spoke first of bombs or hunger. They spoke of cold Cold that sank into bones, cold that crushed hope, cold that erased sensation from fingers and toes. Heating systems failed early in the siege. Without fuel, machinery froze. Pipes burst, boilers cracked, radiators turned into sculptures of ice, their metal skins brittle from pressure. Rooms filled with frost patterns, delicate and vicious, forming lace shapes on inner walls. Families pulled mattresses into kitchens or hallways, trying to trap warmth in spaces no larger than closets. People slept wrapped in coats, scarves, boots, and blankets collected from dead relatives. In some apartments, temperature differences between indoors and outdoors were negligible. Diaries recorded strange sentences. My breath froze under my blanket, and I woke up with ice on my hair. Firewood, normally an afterthought in a modern city, became treasure more valuable than jewelry. Entire neighborhoods stripped trees from parks and boulevards. People dismantled barns, sheds, staircases, and wooden fences. Librarians watched in grief as bookshelves, cabinets, and museum crates were torn apart for fuel. Some burned priceless furniture passed down through generations, heirlooms that had survived revolutions, civil wars, and social upheaval. It was not sentimentality anymore. It was survival mathematics. What produced heat, heat produced life. The cold changed social behavior. People rarely spoke outdoors because it cost energy. They kept their mouths covered to trap breath warmth. They walked more slowly, dragging feet to reduce exposure. The soundscape of the city transformed too. Streets filled with crunching snow, the distant howling of wind, and the eerie silence between artillery barges. Trams stopped running, leaving rails frozen to streets like metal veins beneath ice. In hospitals, cold amplified suffering. Patients lay on beds covered with frost. Nurses could see their breath floating above blankets as they attempted to save lives. Surgeons operated in unheated rooms because pausing meant death. Anesthesia froze in glass jars. Towels stiffened into boards. Medical instruments cracked. Fingers numbed so completely that surgeons sometimes used their wrists to guide scalpels. The cold also shaped death. People who collapsed in streets froze into rigid forms overnight. Bodies lay like statues, limbs reaching upward as if sculpted intentionally. Removal teams sometimes had to break corpses free of ice. Many were so emaciated that winter air mummified them almost instantly. Frozen death became common enough that witnesses described stepping around bodies routinely, murmuring apologies or prayers before continuing toward ration lines. Yet the cold forged unity. Neighbors huddled together in shared rooms, combining warmth. They told stories, shared scraps of food, recited poems, or simply sat in silence, understanding that presence itself meant comfort. The cold turned strangers into families. Winter 1941 to 42 remains crucial to understanding the siege. Hunger starved the body, cold starved the spirit. But those who survived learned endurance beyond imagination. They internalized a truth: when nature and war collide, the will to live becomes its own form of fire. Spring should have brought relief, yet 1942's thaw introduced a new kind of torment. When snow and ice finally melted, Leningrad entered a season of mud, decay, disease, and disappointment. The city's streets, long frozen into hard pathways, dissolved into sludge. Snow that had hidden corpses, garbage, and animal remains melted, exposing horrors beneath. The once white landscape turned brown and gray, filled with rotting debris. Every spring gust revealed new graves. Bodies buried shallowly during winter emerged as the ground softened. Workers rushed to reinter the dead, but there were too many. Cemeteries overflowed. The smell of decay filled the air. People walked through neighborhoods holding cloth pressed over noses to avoid the stench. Though disease outbreaks remained surprisingly limited, the threat felt omnipresent. Doctors worried that the combination of malnutrition and thaw-produced bacteria could spark catastrophic epidemic. The Neva River, now flowing widely, flooded low-lying districts. Buildings weakened by earlier shelling collapsed into muddy water. Sewage lines ruptured, mixing filth into drinking sources. Citizens boiled snow melt or river water, but contamination risk remained. With food supplies still low, sickness spread rapidly. Survivors wrote that fevers became common, wounds healed slowly, and coughs echoed in apartments like war drums. Mud crippled movement. Streets became impassable. People slipped and fell constantly. Breaking bones made brittle by starvation. Broken limbs often spelled death. Hospitals lacked resources for surgery, and bones refused to heal without protein. Even funeral sleds struggled to glide through sludge. Workers pushing corpses to burial sites often fell, lying sprawled in mud too exhausted to stand. Psychologically, spring brought both hope and torment. The sight of sunlight reminded residents of pre-war summers, of festivals, ice cream shops, river picnics, and school vacations. Yet reality denied those memories. People watched warm breezes move through ruined parks and thought, the world continues even if we do not. This emotional contrast deepened grief. The thaw also revealed physical destruction. Buildings once hidden under white blankets of snow now showed terrible wounds. Collapsed roofs, burned beams, shattered windows, and streets littered with shell fragments. Whole districts appeared skeletal, brick frames without walls, chimneys without houses, staircases leading to nothing. Food remained desperately scarce. The road of life functioned better, but supplies could not erase hunger. Farms outside the city lay ruined, livestock gone, and river transport remained vulnerable. Rations rose only slightly. For many, the worst hunger came not during winter, but during spring, when bodies emerged from hibernation, yet still lacked nutrition. Starvation twisted metabolism. Some survivors developed edema, swelling caused by protein deficiency. Legs ballooned painfully, skin cracked, and walking became agonizing. Yet spring offered new forms of resistance. Citizens planted gardens wherever soil existed, courtyards, parks, abandoned flower beds between tram rails, and even in bomb craters. They grew potatoes, cabbage, onions, and beans, though yields were tiny. Still, the act itself gave emotional momentum. Seeds became symbols. Planting them meant believing in tomorrow. Birds returned above the city in spring 1942. Their calls sounded alien after months of silence. Survivors later described hearing sparrows singing and crying, not because of sadness, but because the sound of life seemed overwhelming. Spring did not end suffering, but it reminded Leningrad that cycles continue. Summer would follow. The war would change. Winter would return. And through it all, people would live, even in fragments, because existence itself had become resistance. If winter represented lethal cold and spring symbolized rot, summer brought a different set of challenges and subtle moments of beauty. For the first time in months, sunlight warmed the city, thawing bodies that had been near death from frostbite. But warm air revealed new enemies. Insects, heat exhaustion, dehydration, and intensified bombings. Mosquitoes swarmed over marshlands, breeding near the Neva and canals. They bit starving civilians whose weakened immune systems reacted with feverish swelling. To avoid bites, people covered exposed skin with rags or ash, though this offered little protection. Flies infested ration centers and hospitals. They hovered above corpses not yet buried, swarmed kitchens, and fed on spilled soup. These insects became constant irritants, further weakening morale. Survivors remembered summer itching more painfully than winter freezing. Heat exposed another problem: water scarcity. With pipes destroyed and wells polluted, citizens walked long distances to gather water from communal pumps or rivers. Many fainted along the way. Boiling water required fuel. Fuel required wood. Wood required strength to chop. Everything connected, forming an endless chain of exhaustion. Summer also intensified the smell of war. Without snow to mask decay, the odor of corpses, burned buildings, and industrial smoke spread widely. People gagged in alleyways. Some vomited from overwhelming stench. Heat waves turned apartments into ovens. Though temperatures rarely reached extremes by southern standards, they felt unbearable to malnourished, dehydrated bodies. Yet summer brought life too. Gardens planted in spring sprouted tiny vegetables. Families guarded these plants fiercely, chasing away birds or hungry neighbors. A single onion represented weeks of nutrition. People cared for plants as if they were children, watering them, shielding them from shells, whispering encouragement. Harvest season offered emotional reward. Residents remembered tasting the first potato grown under siege, as if it were dessert. Summer skies also revealed the air war more clearly. Planes roared overhead in bright daylight. Anti-aircraft crews tracked bombers across blue horizons. Children sometimes watched dogfights like theater productions, clapping when Soviet planes fired flares of victory. Parks reopened, not for leisure, but for community tasks. Neighborhood committees organized green brigades to gather leaves for insulation, dig trenches, plant seeds, or clean streets. People who had once adored picnics now used park benches to dry laundry or rest between ration lines. Rivers and canals, free of ice, became transportation routes. Boats carried wounded soldiers, supplies, and occasionally evacuees. Civilians gathered at banks to watch cargo arrive, cheering each arrival. Emotionally, summer brought conflicting feelings. Sunshine felt like a gift and an insult. Life continued even while death dominated the city. Some residents found solace lying outside in warm air, closing their eyes and imagining pre-war holidays. Others avoided sunlight entirely because it reminded them of the world beyond the siege. Parks full of laughter, cities without hunger, rivers without corpses. Despite suffering, summer produced moments of natural beauty. Flowers bloomed along broken sidewalks. Trees sprouted new leaves. The Neva shimmered at sunset. Survivors remembered these sights as surreal. Paradise surrounded by destruction. They spoke of sitting near ruins, watching petals fall, thinking the city still breathes. Insects, heat, rot, and exhaustion turned summer into another battlefield, but also into a season of quiet rebirth. Citizens discovered that survival did not require only bread. It required sensation, feeling sunlight, hearing birdsong, touching leaves. Nature, though cruel, also gave meaning. Winter, spring, and summer together shaped the body and soul of Leningrad. Through seasonal changes, people learned that endurance is not just physical. It is emotional, spiritual, and deeply environmental. The Siege of Leningrad is remembered today not only through military archives, casualty figures, and strategic maps, but through thousands of personal diaries, notebooks, and letters written by ordinary citizens who recorded their existence in the darkest of circumstances. These writings are perhaps the most intimate, humanizing evidence of the siege because they document daily emotions, the fear, anger, hope, and bewilderment of people trapped in catastrophe. Many diarists did not survive. Their notebooks became voices speaking from beyond death. Others lived long enough to see their words published, shaping historical understanding for decades to come. Diaries written during the siege reflect profound emotional evolution. Early entries from summer 1941 speak of confusion and disbelief. This will end soon. We must stay strong. We will show the Germans our spirit. As the blockade tightened and starvation began, tones shifted drastically. Notebooks record empty shelves, missed family meals, and walking long distances to deliver water to hospitals. Then, in winter, the writing changes into minimalist sentences, short, brutal, almost poetic fragments. We are hungry. Father cannot stand. The frost is merciless. There are bodies everywhere. Language itself thinned, just like the bodies of its authors. Perhaps the most famous diary is that of 12-year-old Tanya Savacheva, whose notebook became a symbol of global tragedy. She wrote names and dates of her family members' deaths one by one until she was alone. Her final entry reads, "Everyone is dead. Only Tanya is left. She died soon afterward, evacuated too late for recovery." Her diary traveled to the Nuremberg trials, providing evidence of civilian suffering. But Tanya's diary represents only one voice among thousands. Leningrad children kept picture books filled with drawings of bombings, bread lines, rats, and snowstorms. Students described teachers collapsing from starvation mid-lesson. Nurses wrote about deciding which patients could receive the last spoonful of medicine. Mothers documented attempts to hide fear from children. One woman wrote, "I smile at my daughter so she will not see me dying." Letters between soldiers and families reveal another dimension of tragedy. Because mail service was inconsistent, letters often took months to reach recipients. A soldier might write to his wife, asking if their child was eating well, unaware that the child had died weeks earlier. Many replies were never sent because writers died before posting them. The result: thousands of unfinished correspondences, emotional fragments frozen in time. Some diaries reveal anger towards Soviet leadership. Citizens question ration decisions, evacuation policies, and propaganda optimism. Others recorded support for Stalin, viewing their sacrifice as part of national destiny. The diaries reveal a wide spectrum of belief: rage, faith, despair, patriotism, all existing simultaneously in a single city. These personal writings also record compassion. Many diarists describe strangers giving away food, neighbors helping bury the dead, or unidentified rescuers pulling fainting civilians from snowbanks. They reveal heroism not in battlefield gestures, but in small, quiet, daily acts. Diaries preserved ethical struggle as well. Some writers confessed temptation. "I thought of stealing bread." Others reported guilt over surviving. "Why did I live when she died?" The siege forced people to confront moral boundaries rarely exposed in ordinary life. Today, these diaries and letters form some of the most important historical documents of World War II. They bridge the gap between statistics and humanity, revealing that the siege was not merely a tragedy of millions. It was a tragedy of individuals, each with unique voices, dreams, fears, and memories. In ink, Leningrad lives forever. As decades passed, historians began recording interviews with siege survivors, children who grew into adults, soldiers who defended freezing trenches, and factory workers who welded armor in starvation conditions. These oral histories, collected from the 1950s through the 2010s, revealed emotional truths that written records sometimes could not. Words spoken aloud carried tone, pauses, laughter, cries, and silence, elements that reshape our understanding of memory. Survivors who were children during the siege recalled hunger differently than adults. Many remembered standing in ration lines for hours, clinging to ration cards with fear greater than any nightmare. They remembered walking home, carrying bread so gently it seemed like treasure. They remembered parents cutting slices into perfect portions, dividing crumbs equally, ensuring every child received the same amount. Some described extreme trust. Children often carried rationed bread across long distances alone. No adult escort. Just hope that thieves would not strike. Adults recalled physical sensations in staggering detail. The numbness of fingers, the burn of cold air in lungs, the weight of water buckets carried up staircases, the smell of frozen death in hallways. They described sounds, the crack of ice under boots, the scream of artillery, the silence after bombing raids when the city waited to count bodies. Many survivors spoke of dreams, vivid imaginations of food that haunted sleep. Some dreamed every night of butter melting on warm bread, only to wake to empty tables. Others dreamed of summer strawberries, fish markets, and birthdays with cakes. These dreams gave temporary comfort and unbearable pain. Trauma shaped memory in complex ways. Some survivors recalled the siege with clarity sharper than recent events. Others blocked entire months from memory. Many could recount the exact moment they realized a family member had died, not through announcement, but through silence. Some remembered waking up beside dead relatives whose bodies had grown cold overnight. Oral histories revealed forms of humor and resilience rarely documented. Survivors laughed about absurd ration recipes, like soups made from wallpaper paste or tea brewed from pine needles. They laughed at memories of children sliding across frozen apartment floors in socks, pretending to ice skate. They even laughed about mistakes in bomb drills, at how people sometimes misjudged timing and ended up stuck in stairwells during raids. But interviews also exposed grief deeper than written diaries. Many survivors could not speak of cannibalism cases without trembling. They remembered hearing rumors and fearing for children. They described moral panic, wondering what starvation might turn them into if it continued. Some said they survived not because they were stronger, but because someone else died first. Interviews also revealed an almost universal feeling. Survivors believed they owed life to others. Neighbors, strangers, doctors, soldiers, even fate. They rejected the notion that survival was individual. They insisted it was communal. In later decades, survivors became educators, ensuring the siege was not forgotten. They spoke in schools, museums, and universities. They told children, remember this so it never happens again. They appeared on documentaries, wrote memoirs, and guided historians across old frontline trenches. Many wept not for themselves, but for those who never lived to speak. Oral history teaches that memory is not static. It evolves as survivors grow older, as emotions shift, and as generational distance increases. The siege is not a single narrative. It is a mosaic of thousands of voices, all speaking truth in different tones. The Siege of Leningrad did not end when the German blockade lifted. It continued in memory, politics, and cultural identity. After the war, the city struggled to decide how the tragedy should be remembered. Stalin's government shaped much of the early narrative, emphasizing heroism while suppressing uncomfortable truths. Only decades later did historians uncover deeper layers of trauma. Mass starvation, cannibalism, failed evacuations, and leadership mistakes. Immediately after World War II, Soviet propaganda transformed the siege into a national epic. Films, textbooks, and monuments portrayed Leningrad as an unbroken fortress where citizens willingly sacrificed everything for Stalin and socialism. This narrative highlighted heroism, but ignored civilian anger, dissent, and mistakes. Survivors who expressed criticism often faced social or political danger. Some quietly hid diaries for years, fearing punishment. The post-war government also suppressed documents. Police records on cannibalism were sealed. Reports criticizing ration distribution were classified. Debates over whether evacuations came too late were censored. Leadership wanted a clean, heroic image, not a complex tragedy. Meanwhile, survivors continued living with guilt. Many questioned why they had lived when siblings or parents died. Others wondered whether accepting help or adding water to soup had cost someone else their ration survival. Survivor guilt shaped memory with self-blame instead of pride. During the Khrushchev era of the 1950s and 60s, Soviet society began cautiously discussing darker aspects of the siege. Memoirs appeared, revealing starvation in detail. But censorship still shaped content. Critical voices were softened or ignored. Only after the collapse of the Soviet Union did historians begin accessing full archives. Documents exposed how unprepared leadership had been, how some privileged elites received special rations, and how certain Soviet decisions worsened suffering. These revelations sparked debate. Should national pride tolerate criticism? Could a story be heroic and tragic at the same time? Modern scholarship recognizes the siege as complex. Leningraders were heroes, but not because they were flawless. They were heroes because they were human. They disagreed, made mistakes, argued with neighbors, stole to survive, gave food away, lost hope, regained hope, and kept walking. Their strength came not from perfection, but from perseverance. Memory politics also shaped public monuments. Some memorials honor soldiers at the front. Others remember starving civilians. Cemeteries, such as Piskaryovskoy, hold mass graves where hundreds of thousands rest under grass and stone. Visitors describe overwhelming silence. No individual markers, just long mounds stretching into the distance. The graves remove identity and restore unity. Everyone equal in death, whether child, teacher, worker, or soldier. Cultural memory remains active today. Films, novels, academic studies, and museum exhibits continue to reinterpret the siege. Russian families still tell stories passed down from grandparents. Some preserve ration cards and frames, treat them like sacred relics. Others hold annual remembrance rituals, lighting candles in windows every January. The battle over memory demonstrates that history is not just facts. It is interpretation, perspective, argument, and feeling. The Siege of Leningrad lives on because its story matters not only to Russia, but to all humanity. It raises universal questions. How far can a society endure? What sustains identity under collapse? Can suffering become meaning? And how should the living honor the dead without transforming reality into myth? Diaries contain fiery entries demanding vengeance. People fantasized about defeating Hitler more passionately than about eating bread. Anger gave strength when bodies weakened. It replaced calories with adrenaline. Yet anger did not only target the enemy. Diaries show resentment towards Soviet officials who received better rations. Some citizens blamed the government for not evacuating people early enough. Others questioned ration categories and accused administrators of corruption. These thoughts rarely became public because speaking them risked arrest, but diaries preserved them clearly. Love likewise intensified. Couples married during the siege because love felt like the last human expression they could control. Weddings were tiny, 2 witnesses, 2 rings made from wire, a piece of bread shared as symbolic feast. These ceremonies kept emotional warmth alive. Parents loved children fiercely, surrendering food portions that cost them their own lives. Siblings carried one another across ice. Nurses held dying strangers as lovingly as husbands or wives. Emotional extremes taught survivors a new understanding of humanity. Many later said they saw the purest kindness and the purest cruelty in those years. They saw people risk lives to save strangers, and people steal ration card from orphans. They saw devotion, betrayal, generosity, jealousy, compassion, and barbarity existing together. Hunger reduced social politeness. Conversations became direct, stripped of flattery. People spoke truths bluntly, but emotional honesty deepened relationships. Neighbors became lifelong companions, united by shared endurance. Many siege friendships lasted decades. One of the most paradoxical emotions was shame. Survivors later admitted feeling ashamed for thinking about bread constantly, for ignoring strangers in need, for failing to bury loved ones properly, for crying at minor frustrations. The answers continue to evolve, just as memories do. Leningrad's story will never be fully finished, because every new generation finds new meaning in the voices the siege left behind. One of the most astonishing features of the Siege of Leningrad was that the city's factories continued producing military supplies under conditions that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. Leningrad was an industrial powerhouse before the war, filled with machine plants, shipyards, textile mills, weapons workshops, and scientific laboratories. When supply lines collapsed and starvation crippled the civilian workforce, production did not stop. Instead, it intensified. The city turned into a giant war machine fueled by human desperation and patriotic determination. Factories such as the Kirov plant, Izora Works, and the Baltic shipyard became legendary symbols of resistance. Workers assembled artillery shells, tank armor, naval turbines, torpedoes, and aircraft components despite hunger so severe that many could not stand upright for long. Men and women fainted beside machines, revived with drops of boiled water, and then returned to complete quotas. In freezing workshops, people wrapped themselves in rags or layers of paper. Sparks from welding torches mixed with clouds of icy breath. Metal workers hammered steel plates while weighing half their normal weight. Production quotas did not disappear during the siege, they increased. The government demanded that Leningrad prove itself a fortress not just through defense, but through manufacturing. Supervisors urged workers to view every shell or tank plate as another step toward liberation. Posters inside factories depicted workers alongside soldiers, implying that they were equally vital to victory. Yet the industrial landscape was scarred by constant German bombardment. Shelling damaged roofs, broke windows, destroyed machinery, and killed workers on the job. One artillery strike on munitions plant killed dozens instantly, burying them under rubble mixed with unfinished shells. Production halted for hours, not days, while crews dug through debris, salvaged machinery, and moved surviving equipment to safer floors. The next morning, another shift resumed work as if tragedy were routine. Transportation of industrial goods inside the city posed additional challenges. With fuel scarce and trams broken, workers pushed carts full of ammunition through snowy streets. Trucks traveled only when absolutely necessary, and often at night to avoid enemy aircraft. During the worst months of winter, industrial goods were moved by sled. Civilians volunteered to haul artillery shells through blizzards, dragging ropes through snowdrifts while shells clattered behind them. Women performed the majority of industrial labor because most men were deployed to the front. Some women became machinists or welders with only a few weeks of training. Others worked double shifts, factories by day, watch duty by night. Mothers with starving children became engines of production, believing every bullet manufactured was an act of revenge against those who caused their suffering. Child labor also played a role. Teenagers delivered documents between factory offices, sharpened tools, assembled small mechanical parts, and cleaned machinery. Many students dropped out of school entirely to support their families. Teachers often endorsed this, stating that serving the city mattered more than lessons. Despite misery, workers invented methods to increase efficiency. Engineers redesigned tank armor to reduce steel use, thereby stretching limited resources. Mechanics repaired machinery salvaged from abandoned workshops. Chemists formulated gunpowder substitutes using locally available materials. Industrial creativity, fueled by desperation, helped sustain production longer than German strategists believed possible. Factories also served as emotional shelters. Their noise drowned out artillery fire. Their bright sparks and clanging metal reminded workers of purpose. Many workers said they preferred factory floors to silent apartments where death waited. Inside factories, they felt connected to war outcomes. They were not only suffering, they were fighting. The industrial war in Leningrad remains one of history's most underappreciated stories. It shows that military victory depends not only on battlefield bravery, but on the endurance of those who labor unseen in the heart of conflict. Infrastructure collapse is one of the core reasons the siege of Leningrad became so devastating. Systems that supported civilian life, electricity, water, sanitation, transportation, and communication, were critically damaged within the first months, transforming a modern metropolis into a medieval survival zone. The challenge was not simply maintaining services, but improvising entirely new methods to keep the city alive. Electricity disappeared early in the blockade as power plants ran out of fuel and suffered bomb damage. Without power, factories risked shutdown, hospitals lost lighting and sterilization ability, and homes lost heat. City engineers responded by dividing limited electricity supplies among essential services. Armament factories, military command posts, radio stations, and food warehouses. Civilians were left to live in darkness. The sight of Leningrad at night, almost entirely black, resembled a landscape of ruins. Inside homes, candles became priceless. People crafted makeshift lamps from cooking oil, which produced thick smoke and filled rooms with choking fumes. Water supply collapsed too. Bombings damaged pipelines, while freezing temperatures burst underground mains. People queued at central pumps, rivers, and canals carrying buckets, kettles, and bottles. One photograph shows thousands standing along the frozen Moika River, hacking through ice to reach liquid water beneath. Collecting water became a full-time job. Many families assigned daily roles. One person for fuel, one for water, one for bread. Sanitation deteriorated. Broken pipes flooded basements. Human waste mixed with snow in courtyards. Sewers overflowed into alleyways. Garbage accumulated because disposal trucks stopped functioning. Disease risk soared, yet epidemics remained strangely limited, likely due to extreme cold and reduced population density. However, lice became a pervasive threat. People shaved heads to prevent lice from spreading. Hospitals battled infestations constantly. Public transportation nearly vanished. Trams, which normally stitched together the fabric of the city, stopped due to lack of electricity. Buses ceased running because of fuel shortage. Citizens walked long distances to work, to ration lines, to burial sites, often collapsing en route. Streets became rivers of slow-moving pedestrians. By winter 1941 to 42, the city felt silent not because people were absent, but because the infrastructure that gave movement rhythm had collapsed. Communication systems also nearly died. Telephone networks dropped offline. Postal routes were sporadic. Radio survived only because it was prioritized. Without radio, the city would have faced informational vacuum. a psychological death sentence. Even under bombardment, technicians risked lives repairing transmitters. Families huddled around loudspeakers in public squares to hear war bulletins, music, and speeches. Military communication faced intense pressure. Command posts relied on foot messengers and bicycle couriers who traveled through artillery zones to deliver orders. Some never returned, yet the system worked barely. Without it, Soviet troops outside the city would have fought blind. Infrastructure resilience stands as another miracle of the siege. Teams of engineers, electricians, and sanitation workers continued laboring despite starvation. They repaired pipes in freezing water, risking frostbite. They rewired electrical grids using scavenged cables. They cleaned sewers manually when machines failed. This hidden industrial army saved Leningrad. Their names rarely appear in history books, yet their contribution rivals that of soldiers. While bombs fell and hunger spread, they kept water flowing, light flickering, and messages moving. Without them, the city would have collapsed within months. No symbol of the siege is more iconic than the Road of Life, the frozen transport route across Lake Ladoga that delivered food to Leningrad and evacuated civilians. Without it, the city would have died. Its existence defies logic. An ice highway built under enemy fire, stretching across a vast lake whose surface cracked under weight and shook under shelling. The lake itself was immense, over 6,000 square miles of open water. In summer, barges transported supplies along its waves, dodging aircraft and artillery fire. Pilots flew low to sink cargo ships. Some vessels burned until their wreckage lit the night sky like floating funeral pyres. Soviet sailors maneuvered through storms, ice chunks, and relentless attack to reach Leningrad ports. But winter routes became legendary. Once the lake froze thick enough, engineers marked paths for military trucks. These trucks carried flour, grain, sugar, meat, fuel, munitions, and medical supplies into the city. They returned carrying orphans, wounded soldiers, elderly civilians, and entire families desperate to escape. Millions of lives depended on traffic that could end at any moment. The Road of Life was never truly safe. German air squadrons hunted trucks from dawn to dusk, machine-gunning convoys across glaring ice. Bombs shattered frozen surfaces, opening deadly holes that swallowed vehicles. Survivors described the horrifying sound of cracking ice beneath tires, like thunder rumbling through metal. Drivers kept windows open so they could hear fractures forming. Silence meant death. Many drivers were women and teenagers. They sat behind frozen steering wheels wearing multiple coats and blankets, steering through darkness guided only by lantern posts. Some fell asleep from exhaustion. Others hallucinated from hunger. Trucks sometimes drifted off course and vanished under snowstorms. Drivers knew, each time they crossed the lake, that there was a real chance they would never return. Yet they continued because abandonment of duty would mean abandoning the city itself. Evacuation across the lake saved hundreds of thousands of lives. Children, orphans, and the sick were loaded onto convoys wrapped in blankets. Some died during transport, their bodies frozen solid before trucks reached shore. Others survived only to discover hunger continued outside the city. The Road of Life extended beyond the lake. Railways built along Ladoga's southern shore sped up deliveries. Workers hammered tracks under gunfire, laying steel across marshlands and snowdrifts. Once trains operated, supply volumes increased dramatically, allowing factories to resume higher production. The Road of Life became cultural symbol and emotional anchor. Citizens listened for news of its status each day. If it remained open, hope remained alive. Poems, songs, and radio broadcasts praised its drivers as heroes of equal rank to soldiers. One song described the road drawn across death, a line that captured how reality and myth blended. Even today, Ladoga remains sacred in collective memory. Survivors recite stories of crossing the ice, hearing explosions behind them, crying from fear or relief. Monuments line the lake shore. Museums preserve convoys' artifacts. The Road of Life stands not merely as logistics achievement, but as moral lesson. When humanity is cornered, courage creates pathways where nature and enemy conspire to close them. The evacuation of Leningrad remains one of the most emotionally complicated and logistically extraordinary operations in Soviet history. It began even before German armies fully encircled the city, continued through the brutal establishment of the Road of Life, and lasted until the siege was broken. Civilians, children, scientists, military personnel, cultural treasures, and entire factories were relocated out of the urban battlefield. Yet the process was marked by chaos, hope, sacrifice, confusion, and tragedy. Millions moved, and hundreds of thousands never arrived. Before the blockade closed completely in September 1941, Soviet authorities attempted to evacuate large segments of the population. The initial priority was children. Trains transported schools and orphanages eastward toward Vologda, Arkhangelsk, the Urals, and Siberia. But German forces bombed railway lines constantly, destroying carriages full of young evacuees. Survivors described terrifying journeys. Children lying flat on train floors while explosions shook the frames, teachers whispering comfort despite their own terror. Others never reached safety. Bombing raids annihilated entire trains, leaving no survivors to record details. The second priority was factory workers and equipment. Soviet command planned that if the Germans took Leningrad, its industrial knowledge must remain safe. Machine parts, blueprints, turbines, and scientific instruments were packed in crates and shipped east. Some factories were disassembled entirely and rebuilt in the Urals. Workers traveled with machines, continuing production under new roofs. Many later described these relocations as traumatic uprooting, leaving starving families behind in a collapsing city while boarding trains that led to relative safety and full rations. Boxer-like factory leaders often wept while departing because they knew their survival meant abandoning home. Once the blockade fully tightened, rail evacuation ended. At that moment, the Road of Life across Lake Ladoga became the only escape. Hundreds of thousands crossed by truck in winter and by boat in summer. Families waited at assembly points holding bundles of clothing, documents, and photographs. Children clung to parents, fearful they would be separated. Some families were split on purpose. Authorities prioritized evacuating the youngest, leaving adults behind as workers or soldiers. Many mothers sent children to safety knowing they themselves would likely die before war ended. Diaries described this as the ultimate sacrifice, saving a future by letting go of the present. Evacuation itself was perilous. Trucks crossing Ladoga plunged through ice after shell explosions. Survivors later recalled hearing screams echo across frozen darkness, knowing no rescue was possible. Boat convoys suffered Luftwaffe attacks, burning on water while evacuees jumped into waves to escape flames, drowning within minutes from hypothermia. Drivers, sailors, and guards risked their lives repeatedly, not for glory, but because survival depended on movement. On the receiving end of the evacuation route, Soviet cities struggled to absorb refugees. Some evacuees arrived severely malnourished, too weak to walk. Local families volunteered to house strangers. Schools turned into dormitories. Hospitals became long-term care wards. Yet even safety did not guarantee health. Many evacuees died weeks after arrival. their bodies incapable of reversing starvation damage. Meanwhile, within Leningrad, those who remained faced increasingly empty neighborhoods. Buildings echoed without children. Schools closed temporarily due to lack of students. Parks grew silent. Entire districts felt hollow, like shells filled with snow rather than laughter. Yet for those who survived, knowing their loved ones had escaped gave emotional fuel. Evacuation decisions also reveal ethical complexity. Not everyone had equal chance to leave. Party officials and elites often arranged early departures. Workers in essential factories were denied evacuation, told their skill outweighed their right to survive. Soldiers' families were frequently ordered to remain as patriotic symbol. Complaints existed, though rarely documented openly because criticism risked arrest. Despite injustice and tragedy, evacuation saved lives and preserved Leningrad's future. Many children returned after the war to rebuild their city. In their memory, the road of life remains not only a transport route, it is a bridge between death and tomorrow. The Siege of Leningrad killed more civilians than any other city siege in recorded world history. Though official Soviet statistics long claimed approximately 600,000 deaths, modern historians estimate casualties above 1 million, possibly closer to 1.5 million. But numbers alone cannot convey reality. Death in Leningrad was not abstract. It lived in every street, doorway, stairwell, and apartment. It arrived silently, endlessly, without pause or mercy. The primary cause of death was starvation. Winter of 1941 to 42 reduced daily bread rations to amounts insufficient to sustain life. 125 grams for dependents and children, 250 grams for workers, and slightly higher for heavy laborers. Most bread contained sawdust, soy husks, and cellulose, delivering little nutrition. Weight loss hit catastrophic levels. Adults shrank to half or even 1/3 of their body weight. Children's ribs protruded like cage bars. Their bodies swelled from edema, a desperate reaction to protein deficiency. Doctors wrote that corpses resembled skeletons wrapped in skin. Starvation weakened the immune system until minor wounds became fatal. People who cut fingers chopping would sometimes die from infection weeks later. Teeth fell out, gums bled, hair clumped away from skulls. Muscle tissue dissolved into fuel for organs. Eventually, the body consumed its own heart, literally shrinking it, until circulation ceased. Diseases flourished. Dysentery, scurvy, and typhus spread through communal apartments. Scurvy, especially, left unmistakable marks. Swollen gums, dark skin patches, fragile blood vessels that burst at slight pressure. Without fresh vegetables, vitamin C vanished from diets. Doctors treated children with pine needle infusions and cold water therapies, but death often came anyway. Winter conditions ensured constant bodies on streets. People collapsed walking to ration queues, fell asleep on benches and never woke, or froze while fetching water. Corpses sometimes remained outside for days until burial crews arrived. Survivors describe stepping around bodies so normal it no longer terrified them. Death became background texture, not shocking event. Mass graves expanded across the city. Cemeteries filled within weeks. Workers dug graves through ice and frozen clay, swinging pickaxes while numb from cold. Many graves held dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies at once. Identity records fractured. Many buried under unknown markers because relatives were too weak to accompany them. Starvation deaths occurred behind doors too. Families found relatives dead in armchairs, still holding bread cards. Children discovered mothers lifeless on kitchen floors. People died quietly while reading newspapers, listening to radio broadcasts, or staring at walls. One haunting feature of siege mortality was emotional numbness. Diaries describe neighbors ignoring bodies left in hallways, not from cruelty, but from lack of strength. When every calorie mattered, carrying corpses was physically impossible for most civilians. Cannibalism emerged as last resort for a minority. Police records reveal about 2,000 documented cases, true numbers likely higher. Most cases involved eating the already dead, though murder existed. Authorities executed perpetrators to protect social order. Survivors rarely speak of this, but its existence shows the siege pushed humanity to its bleakest edge. Infant mortality soared. Pregnant women miscarried frequently because starvation destroyed reproductive function. Babies born alive rarely survived their first months. Death did not strike evenly. The elderly died fastest. Children ranked next. Manual laborers lived longer due to better rations. Government workers and party members received special supplies, surviving at higher rates. This inequality created silent resentment that diaries occasionally reveal. But open discussion remained dangerous under Stalinist rule. Mortality shaped the psychology of living. People prepared mentally for death, writing final letters, arranging possessions, and saying goodbye to family members too tired to speak. Many survivors later said they survived not because they were stronger, but because death chose others randomly. Today, burial sites across Leningrad, especially Piskryovskoye Cemetery, represent the silent proof of starvation genocide. Hundreds of thousands lie beneath marked earth rows, each mound representing thousands of unnamed victims. Visiting these places reveals truth beyond statistics. Every grave, an ocean of stories. The long-term demographic consequences of the siege were profound. Before the blockade, Leningrad had a population of roughly 3.2 million. By 1944, fewer than 800,000 remained in the city, most of them women, elderly people, and children. The siege reshaped the entire social structure of urban life. Gender ratios changed dramatically. Men died in greater numbers because most fought on the front or worked in heavy industrial labor. Women became majority population leaders, caregivers, administrators, and laborers. Children who survived grew into adults shaped permanently by trauma. Their worldview, maturity, emotional strength, and fear responses differed from later generations. Many learned never to waste food, fearing hunger even when abundance returned. Some developed lifelong hoarding habits, collecting bread crusts, sugar cubes, or jars. Others dedicated their careers to medicine or history because memory of suffering pushed them to prevent repeat catastrophes. The elderly population nearly vanished. Older civilians lacked physical resilience to endure starvation. Their death removed intergenerational knowledge and fractured family structures. Grandparents once responsible for cultural preservation disappeared, leaving emotional silence in family identity. Ethnic minorities living in Leningrad, Tatars, Jews, Estonians, Finns, and others, experienced unique challenges. Some were drafted into the army, others were evacuated. Some remained under siege and died in large numbers. Soviet policy rarely acknowledged their specific experiences, but modern research works to give voice to their stories. The siege also changed class identity. Pre-war Leningrad contained intellectual elites, aristocratic survivors, industrial managers, and artists. After the siege, the city became dominated by working class and scientific communities dedicated to rebuilding infrastructure. Many pre-war cultural institutions lost staff permanently. Museums reopened slowly. Hospitals were understaffed. Universities lacked professors. The city experienced massive psychological transformation. Survivors formed deep emotional bonds with one another, calling themselves blokadniki, a term representing shared trauma and civic pride. They created associations, clubs, and public memorial organizations. Blokadniki received special pensions and state recognition, though many believed honor arrived too late. Marriage patterns shifted. Because so many men died, women often remained unmarried or married wounded veterans. Childbirth spikes occurred after 1945 as citizens attempted to rebuild population. These children grew up surrounded by adults haunted by silence and memories of winter famine. Urban planning evolved too. Post-war Leningrad rebuilt housing, schools, and roads faster than expected, but invisible scars remained. Neighborhoods that once contained thousands now held hundreds. Some buildings were never repaired, left as war memorials. Factories resumed production at pre-war levels, though with new workforces and reorganized structures. Perhaps the most fascinating social result was how siege identity forged long-term civic pride. Survivors valued endurance above comfort, unity above individuality. They viewed Leningrad not simply as a city, but as sacred ground. Modern St. Petersburg still carries this identity. Streets, museums, libraries, and parks host plaques marking siege events. The city's culture honors silence, memory, and collective dignity. People speak proudly of ancestors who endured starvation rather than surrender. The siege transformed a metropolis into a mythic emblem of human endurance, where suffering shaped identity, memory shaped citizenship, and survival shaped destiny. Through evacuation, death, and demographic transformation, the siege permanently altered who lived in Leningrad and how they understood themselves. The city that emerged was not the same city that entered the war, but it endured, rebuilt, and remembered. The Siege of Leningrad was not only a physical ordeal, it was a catastrophe of perception, identity, and mental structure. For 3 years, people existed in a psychological environment unmatched in modern urban history. Continual hunger, loss, infection, bombardment, grief, fear, cold, boredom, isolation, and exhaustion formed a mental storm capable of destroying any sense of self. To understand how people survived psychologically, we must first understand how starvation alters the brain. Severe caloric deficit starves neurons. Synapses fire slowly. Neurotransmitter levels collapse. Starvation causes short-term memory loss, disorientation, hallucinations, and emotional flattening. Diaries reveal how mental language changed. Early siege writing displays emotional expression, descriptive imagery, and future expectation. By the deepest starvation months, words became blunt, stripped down, minimalistic, cold today, nobriath, mother worse. As bodies dissolved, language dissolved alongside them. Psychologists studying siege diaries describe a phenomenon called siege consciousness, a mental state defined by tunnel vision. People focused on a tiny daily list. Get bread, boil water, stay warm, stay alive. Higher ambitions vanished. Creativity faded or, paradoxically, exploded as a form of escape. Some individuals formed obsessive routines, repeating tasks to maintain sanity, arranging ration cards, sharpening pencils, counting footsteps to water stations. Rituals replaced planning. Repetition replaced hope. Mental adaptation involved emotional detachment. People learned to speak about death calmly, mechanically. Witnesses described stepping over corpses every morning on Nevsky Prospect with the same lack of shock as stepping over fallen branches. It was the brain's survival instinct. If horror remained shocking, the psyche would break. So it converted shock into numbness. Yet not everyone experienced numbness alone. Some suffered acute mental collapse. Doctors recorded delusions. People believing ration lines hid secret supplies. Others whispering that German soldiers were disguised as civilians. Many experienced memory breaks, forgetting conversations, losing words mid-sentence, forgetting where they lived. Starvation produced confusion so profound that people sometimes stood motionless for hours, unable to decide where to walk. And still, the human mind adapted. It found defensive mechanisms: humor, imagination, painting, poetry, religion, denial. Some survivors later said, "We did not allow ourselves to think." Thought required calories. Thinking about death consumed energy. Thinking about hope risked heartbreak. So many citizens narrowed perception to the present second and refused mental travel beyond it. Psychologists describe this as survival cognition, a mode where time compression protects sanity. Music also reshaped cognition. When orchestras rehearsed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony, players described transcending hunger. Their brains released endorphins. Music created inner heat. Audience members cried not just from emotion, but from neurological relief. Music chemically fed the brain. Another psychological phenomenon was identity shift. Before the siege, people defined themselves by profession, class, or ambition. I am a teacher, I am a musician, I am a scholar. During starvation, identity collapsed into two categories: living and dying. Occupation lost meaning because energy to practice skills vanished. Yet this collapse also created a new identity: the blokadnik, the siege survivor. People united under this new category, finding purpose in collective endurance. Post-siege interviews show how deep transformation ran. Many survivors lost interest in luxury and material comfort permanently. They valued bread above gold, silence above noise, warmth above fashion. They carried heavy empathy for the poor. They distrusted abundance because they had seen how quickly life collapses. Childhood survivors developed profound maturity. They learned emotional control far beyond their years. Many psychologists note that siege trauma produced strong philosophical orientation. Survivors pondered destiny, free will, purpose, and morality at unusually young ages. Ultimately, the siege shows the duality of human psychology: how hunger can erase identity, yet also how identity can rebuild from ashes. Leningraders discovered that the human mind, when surrounded by death, seeks not only food, but meaning. People imagine siege life as nonstop terror, yet psychological records show life included long hours of boredom broken by seconds of panic. The air raid sirens did not sound constantly. Artillery did not explode every minute. Much of siege existence involved waiting for bread lines to move, for fires to burn out, for the next winter to pass, for news from the front, for trucks bringing flour, for morning light to return. During these silent stretches, boredom became suffocating. People lacked energy to read, lacked light to write, lacked concentration to hold conversation. They sat for hours listening to their own breathing, hearing pipes creak, wind howl, walls settle. Some describe silence, so absolute it felt heavier than artillery thunder. Yet fear always lurked beneath monotony. Every step outdoors carried risk: bombs, thieves' collapse, sudden cardiac death from starvation. Even indoors, fear persisted. Cold might kill you in sleep, disease might spread through walls, hunger might rob you of will to move. Women worried continuously about children losing strength. Families feared each knock at the door would bring news of death. But despite terror, hope survived. Hope appeared in radio broadcasts describing Soviet victories at Stalingrad. It appeared when someone found an extra potato in rations. It appeared when spring sunlight entered broken windows. Hope arrived when neighbors shared stories, when teachers recited poetry, when musicians played in basements. It arrived in absurd forms, like laughter at mistakes or jokes about ice forming on eyelashes indoors. Anger also shaped emotional life. Survivors felt rage toward German forces, whom they blamed for murder by starvation. Shame lingered long after siege ended, proof of the psychological scar starvation inflicts. Through all of this, love for Leningrad remained unbroken. Citizens believed their city embodied beauty, culture, and national soul. Even starving, they refused evacuation because they felt bound to the streets that shaped them. Emotional identity fused with geography. To leave was betrayal. Thus, the emotional landscape of the siege was not defined by one feeling, but by a storm of feelings, conflicting, overlapping, constantly shifting. And incredibly, these emotions did not destroy the people. They sustained them. The siege officially ended in January 1944, but psychological consequences lasted lifetimes. Survivors carried trauma into adulthood, influencing careers, marriages, parenting styles, political beliefs, and worldviews. Understanding post-siege psychological evolution reveals something profound. Trauma does not merely wound the mind, it reshapes it. Many survivors developed classic post-traumatic stress symptoms before the term PTSD existed. They suffered invasive memories, nightmares, flashbacks triggered by hunger, cold, or sudden noises. Some avoided winter altogether, moving south in later life because snow awakened memories too painful to bear. Others feared thunderstorms because artillery echoes resembled bombardment. Food remained central in survivor identity. Even in old age, they saved breadcrumbs after meals, stored jars of grain in cupboards, and never allowed plates to leave tables unfinished. Children of siege survivors recalled parents who panicked when bread shelves appeared empty at stores, even decades later. Food anxiety became cultural inheritance. Another legacy was emotional restraint. Survivors rarely cried publicly. They avoided complaining, believing their suffering could never compare to the siege. Many considered expressions of pain weak or disrespectful to the dead. This emotional strength sometimes created distance between generations. Siege survivors found it difficult to comfort children in emotional distress because their own emotional scale had been recalibrated by war. At the same time, survivors became remarkably compassionate. They donated to orphanages, helped war widows, and volunteered for hospitals. They valued human life more intensely because they had witnessed death intimately. Many became social workers, teachers, or doctors to prevent others from suffering. But not all effects were positive. Some survivors struggled with alcoholism, depression, insomnia, and social withdrawal. They feared attachment because starvation had taught them how easily loved ones vanish. Some marriages dissolved because partners could not share trauma experience equally. Others overprotected children, fearing loss. Intergenerational trauma also shaped families. Children raised by Blokadniki grew up listening to stories of siege winters. Some internalized fear of hunger. Others rejected emotional gravity and resented silence. These children often describe differing emotional languages within families. Parents speaking memory, children speaking normalcy. The siege influenced political identity deeply. Survivors tended to vote in support of strong state leadership, believing only centralized power could defend Russia. They distrusted Western interpretations of history that criticized Soviet decisions. To them, the state, even flawed, was savior. Memory culture became sacred ritual. Survivors returned yearly to grave sites. They attended commemorations, school programs, and museum exhibitions. They led tours through former trenches, telling children, "This happened to us. We survived." Remember, some survivors later wrote that the siege taught them meaning of life. Every breath mattered, every sunrise a blessing, every act of kindness holy. They claimed suffering revealed humanity's core truth, that compassion sustains existence more than food or shelter. The legacy of siege psychology remains in St. Petersburg today. Residents honor silence, reflection, poetry, and emotional dignity. The city carries identity shaped by trauma, pride, endurance, and artistry. The siege did not break Leningrad's mind. It reforged it. Post-siege generations inherit resilience, awareness that civilization can collapse, yet humanity can rise. The siege proved people can survive almost anything, not because they are strong, but because they refuse to surrender meaning. To understand why the Siege of Leningrad became the deadliest urban starvation event in history, we must examine German motivations, strategy, and expectations. Adolf Hitler never saw Leningrad merely as a military target. He viewed it as a symbol, a birthplace of Bolshevism, cultural rival to German power, and population center holding millions of Slavs he intended to exterminate. The Nazi plan was not to conquer Leningrad through direct infantry assault and then govern it like occupied Paris. Their intention was annihilation through siege, starvation, and erasure. When Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, German forces moved with astonishing speed across Soviet territory. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, advanced toward the Baltic states, destroying Soviet units along rail corridors and highways. German and Finnish forces coordinated to cut Leningrad off from the rest of Russia. Hitler did not want to waste troops on bloody street fighting. He planned to starve the city into surrender. Official German documents prove this. One memorandum stated clearly that Leningrad should be erased from the face of the earth and its population allowed to die. The German high command believed the city would collapse in months. They viewed Soviet resistance as weak and expected hunger to do the work faster than bullets. Confidence was high. By September 1941, German troops had reached the southern outskirts of Leningrad. Finnish forces held the northern boundary. Suburbs lay shattered, and rail lines were severed. A ring of steel formed around the city, backed by heavy artillery positioned to destroy infrastructure and morale. Leningrad was not supposed to survive the winter. German planners estimated their encirclement tightened irrevocably when Schlüsselburg fell, severing the last land connection to the Soviet interior. Commanders predicted starvation would kill the civilian population, freeing them from the need to storm the city's defenses. The strategy was chillingly simple. Cut food, cut power, cut escape, and let the population consume itself. This brutal plan also had ideological dimensions. Hitler hated Leningrad because it bore Lenin's name. Destroying it would erase a symbol of communism. He dreamed of leveling the city, draining the Neva River, and giving the land to German settlers. He saw the city's artistic legacy, its palaces, museums, and libraries, not as treasures, but as obstacles to German dominance. The German approach involved relentless shelling. Artillery batteries targeted bakeries, hospitals, water stations, and apartment blocks. They aimed to break not only Soviet military resistance, but the psychological endurance of civilians. Many guns had precise coordinates mapped to ration centers. During bread distribution hours, German artillery intensified fire, resulting in horrifying civilian casualties. This tactic reveals deliberate cruelty, not accidental tragedy. Yet the strategy contained flaws. The Germans underestimated Soviet industrial relocation efforts. They assumed Leningrad factories would fall silent when surrounded. not realizing equipment had already been moved east to the Urals. They believed the Red Army had no strength left to counterattack. They failed to anticipate that the Soviet military would transform surrounding forests into defensive labyrinths. Another miscalculation was morale. Instead of surrendering, citizens became more stubborn. German commanders later reported disbelief that people continued working in factories, burying dead, and even playing symphonies. The psychological war backfired. Terror hardened resolve. The German high command also underestimated the impact of fighting elsewhere. When the Wehrmacht stalled near Moscow and Stalingrad, German attention and resources shifted, weakening the northern offensive. Army Group North lacked reinforcement and resupply needed to storm the city completely. Finally, Lake Ladoga remained a lifeline the Germans never fully severed. Their failure to control Ladoga airspace and naval territory prevented total starvation. If they had cut the lake route, the city likely would have died. Thus, German plans for quick victory dissolved. What Hitler expected to be a triumph of European supremacy became a grinding stalemate. The siege, instead of crushing Soviet identity, strengthened it. The German strategy of starvation produced a moral catastrophe that echoed through history and united the Soviet people in resistance. The defense of Leningrad stands as one of the most complex, multi-layered military operations of World War II. The city was defended not only by the Red Army surrounding its perimeter, but by militia units, naval fleets, internal security forces, anti-aircraft divisions, and civilian brigades. The leadership structure changed repeatedly, yet cooperation remained strong enough to prevent collapse. Before the siege began, Soviet high command recognized Leningrad's strategic and symbolic value. It represented Soviet industry, culture, and ideology. Losing it would shatter morale nationwide. Thus, the city was transformed into fortress territory. Streets were mined, bridges wired to blow, parks converted to firing zones, factories redesigned to produce weapons. Even school children received basic defense training. Command leadership during the siege included prominent figures such as Georgy Zhukov, who was sent to Leningrad in September 1941 to stabilize defenses. Zhukov reorganized military control, strengthened command discipline, and ordered counterattacks that slowed the German advance. His aggressive tactics prevented German forces from breaching the city's southern defenses. Zhukov later left to direct the Moscow defense, but his work in Leningrad remained foundation for survival. Marshal Leonid Govorov later took command of Leningrad front, orchestrating coordinated offensives, artillery improvements, and strategic planning that eventually liberated supply routes. Govorov understood that brute force alone would not succeed. Timing, terrain knowledge, and artillery superiority mattered. Defensive warfare occurred on three fronts simultaneously. Southern Front, facing German lines near Pushkin and Kolpino. Northern Front, facing Finnish forces who did not directly storm the city. Lake Ladoga sector, balancing supply defense and naval control. The Soviet Air Force played a vital role despite overwhelming odds. Pilots flew missions with inadequate fuel, outdated fighters, and minimal ammunition. They protected food convoys and provided reconnaissance. Even when losing dogfights, their presence forced Germans to divert resources. Naval forces within the Baltic Fleet contributed artillery from huge naval guns anchored near the city. Warships trapped in freezing harbors became floating fortresses, firing shells dozens of kilometers inland. Naval officers trained civilians in combat basics and helped construct river defenses. Militia units, composed of elderly workers, professors, students, and women, fought side by side with professional soldiers. These militias dug trenches, carried ammunition, built barricades, and manned anti-aircraft guns. Some fought without winter uniforms. Civilians sometimes went to the front in overcoats and scarves rather than military gear. Despite starvation, morale did not collapse. Soldiers ate rations barely larger than civilians, but they marched, fired, patrolled, and wrote letters home. They understood their position. By protecting the city, they protected its millions. If lines broke even once, German forces would enter residential districts and massacre would follow. This belief strengthened endurance. The Soviets also built underground bunkers, command tunnels, and hidden repair depots. Engineers dug cable trenches through frozen earth to preserve communication. Medical units operated in bunkers and forest huts to prevent air detection. Strategic counterattacks began in January 1943 with Operation Iskra, which partially broke the blockade by opening a land corridor south of Lake Ladoga. Though narrow, this corridor allowed railway construction, transforming supply capacity. The city went from near death to revival within months. By January 1944, Soviet forces launched a massive offensive that drove German armies westward, permanently ending the siege. The victory was not only tactical, but psychological. Leningrad proved endurance could defeat invasion. Starvation could produce strength rather than surrender. The defense of Leningrad remains a military miracle, not because soldiers had superior weapons or numbers, but because they combined industrial capacity, psychological resilience, environmental adaptation, and unified leadership under almost impossible conditions. Frontline soldiers fighting outside Leningrad endured conditions nearly as brutal as those inside the city, but with added constant combat pressure. The environment around the city was one of the most difficult battlegrounds on Earth. Forests tangled with roots, swamps that swallowed boots, trenches frozen rock hard, and skies filled with enemy aircraft. Trench warfare defined daily military existence. Soldiers dug systems that stretched for miles across marshland, reinforced with logs and dirt. Winter turned trenches into icy coffins. Men slept standing or half-sitting to avoid frostbite. Snow filled dugouts. Rain turned tunnels into mud chambers crawling with vermin. Firefights erupted at random hours. Machine guns rattling in sudden bursts. Mortar shells screaming through trees. Soldiers diving into slush to avoid shrapnel. Sniper warfare became a defining feature of the Leningrad front. Marksmen on both sides studied tree branches, rooftops, shadows, and trench edges. A single sniper could shut down foot movement for hours. Diaries describe soldiers frozen still because one German sharpshooter waited patiently on the other side. Soviet snipers countered with equal skill, some becoming legendary. Their duels were not just tests of aim, but psychological battles. Who could remain silent longer? Who could breathe softer in minus 30 degrees air? Who could aim without shaking from hunger? Forest warfare was brutal. Infantry units crawled across pine floors, rifles wrapped in cloth to prevent sound, searching for German patrols hidden between trees. Sightlines stretched only a few meters. Soldiers described seeing eyes before seeing uniforms. Fighting at night required intuition more than sight. Men listened for broken twigs and followed smell of cigarette smoke. Shell shock was pervasive. Soldiers wrote that hearing artillery for months changed their perception. Thunderstorms sounded like death. Fireworks like air raids. Many became emotionally numb, joking about incoming shells as if speaking of weather. Others prayed constantly, whispering names of children back home. One fascinating dimension of trench life was camaraderie. Soldiers shared rations, blankets, and stories. They protected each other fiercely, risking lives to drag wounded comrades through snow. Bonds formed stronger than blood. Many veterans later said losing comrades hurt more than starvation ever had. Supply shortages shaped combat. Rifles sometimes froze, machine gun belts jammed, grenades failed to ignite. Soldiers urinated on weapon bolts to thaw them. Boots fell apart, feet bled. Frostbite amputations became routine. Yet soldiers continued marching and firing, believing surrender meant death for family and homeland. German troops suffered terribly as well. They endured Russian winters without proper gear, watched Soviet artillery destroy positions, and fought against a population unwilling to surrender. Letters home from Wehrmacht's soldiers reveal despair. The Russians do not fall. This land is teeth and ice. We are dying in silence. There will the fight weakened over time as casualties rose. The Leningrad front was not static. Raids occurred constantly. Scouts infiltrated enemy lines at night to gather information or capture prisoners. These missions required extreme courage, crawling across open snowfields under moonlight, each movement risking a sniper shot. Soldiers also witnessed unimaginable horrors. Frozen corpses used as trench reinforcement walls, body parts buried under snowbanks, and entire units wiped out by single artillery barges. But they also witnessed moments of humanity, exchanging cigarettes with enemies during temporary ceasefires, hearing enemy songs drift through forest fog, feeling pity for opposing soldiers equally starving and cold. War in the forests outside Leningrad forged identities. Survivors returned home changed, quieter, slower, thoughtful, respectful of silence. They understood fragility and endurance deeply. Their memories remain written in scars, diaries, and graves hidden under moss and pine needles. The Siege of Leningrad was not an isolated tragedy known only to its victims. It unfolded under the gaze of international journalists, diplomats, and governments who watched from afar, often stunned by the scale and brutality of German strategy. From the earliest months of the siege, news traveled across the world through Soviet broadcasts, underground communication channels, and foreign correspondents stationed in Moscow. The world learned, piece by piece, that a major European city had become a starvation chamber. Yet responses varied widely. Some nations expressed sympathy, others strategic calculation, and some maintained silence. In the United States, newspapers like the New York Times and Chicago Tribune published reports describing Leningrad under heavy bombardment. Journalists emphasized civilian resilience and praised Soviet bravery. They reported that families melted snow for drinking water, that bread rations had dropped to unimaginable levels, and that even children served the war effort. American propaganda promoted Leningrad as heroic, partly to justify increasing support for the Soviet Union after Germany declared war on the United States in December 1941. Prior to this alliance, however, Western reactions were mixed. Public sympathy existed, but governments hesitated because the USSR was not yet a wartime partner. Britain expressed emotional support earlier. Winston Churchill admired Soviet resistance, viewing the defense of Leningrad as proof that Hitler's armies were not invincible. British newspapers published stories of starving civilians refusing to surrender. Politicians used Leningrad as an example to motivate the British public. If Russians could endure starvation, Britain could endure bombings. British families knit scarves and sweaters to send to the Soviet Union. Schools collected food tins and medicine. These symbolic acts fostered cultural friendship, though material support remained limited by wartime logistics. In neutral countries, reactions fluctuated between sympathy and political caution. Sweden, situated close to Leningrad, received refugee reports through Finland and radio waves. Swedish citizens collected aid supplies anonymously, some smuggling medicine across the Baltic. Switzerland published humanitarian editorials condemning German tactics. Yet neutrality restricted deeper involvement. Germany and Axis states portrayed the siege differently. Nazi propaganda insisted Soviet civilians were armed threats. They called Leningrad a nest of communism that deserved destruction. Axis newspapers celebrated German encirclement as proof of Aryan superiority. They published exaggerated stories claiming Soviet society had collapsed into cannibal chaos, mocking starvation as weakness. These reports attempted to dehumanize the victims and justify genocide. Meanwhile, Allied nations recognized the siege as a strategic turning point. Military planners studied the starving city closely. Some believed that if Leningrad fell, the German army would be free to march toward Murmansk, cutting off Arctic supply routes. Others feared German success would allow them to merge with Finnish forces fully and sweep into the Soviet interior. Thus, many Allied leaders quietly prayed for Leningrad's survival, not only for humanitarian reasons, but for war outcome. The international humanitarian community struggled to respond. The Red Cross attempted to pressure Germany to allow food shipments, but Nazi leadership ignored demands. Blockade warfare violated ethical norms, yet no institution possessed power to stop Hitler's plan. Even if relief agencies wanted to deliver food, impossible military conditions prevented it. Cultural responses also developed. Western poets wrote verses dedicated to Leningrad. Artists painted imagined scenes of frozen streets and bombed cathedrals. Musicians later performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony in London and New York, using art to raise awareness and build emotional bridges. The world's perception of the siege was shaped equally by truth and imagination. Without photographs or real-time networks, foreigners relied on written descriptions. Many Americans imagined Leningrad like a snow-covered medieval fortress. Europeans imagined mothers walking through bomb smoke with infant corpses wrapped in blankets. These visual constructs, while sometimes exaggerated, reflected emotional truth. International awareness did not end with the war. In the decades following the siege, historians worldwide studied the blockade, revealing comparisons between Leningrad and Warsaw, Dresden, Tokyo, and Berlin. Today, the siege remains a universal symbol, not only of Soviet suffering, but of human endurance under genocidal intent. Although foreign nations could not break the German ring around Leningrad, Allied assistance influenced the city indirectly through broad strategic effort and crucial supply contributions. Lend-Lease aid provided by the United States and Canada proved invaluable. Though few shipments reached the city directly, they fueled the wider Soviet war economy, which in turn supported Leningrad's defense. Allied ships carried food, trucks, aircraft, aluminum, locomotives, machine tools, and medical supplies to Soviet ports at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk. From there, the goods traveled across rail networks to the front. Trucks delivered by Lend-Lease later drove across the road of life on Lake Ladoga, transporting flour and grain into Leningrad. The sight of American Studebaker trucks crossing frozen water became a symbol of international cooperation. Veterans recalled feeling gratitude. These vehicles were powerful, reliable, and capable of enduring terrible conditions. Aircraft supplied through Lend-Lease helped the Red Air Force defend the skies above Leningrad. They intercepted German bombers targeting infrastructure and ration warehouses, while Soviet engineering played greatest role in air defense. International equipment made operations smoother. Diplomatically, the United States approached the siege with careful language. American leaders expressed sympathy, praised Soviet heroism, and condemned Nazi atrocities. Yet they avoided statements promising direct intervention, knowing they lacked military ability to rescue the city. The focus remained on defeating Germany overall, not on opening specific corridors. British assistance took symbolic and cultural forms as well. Reports of Leningrad circulated in Britain's schools, inspiring children to donate money and knit supplies. Winston Churchill sent personal messages to Soviet leaders expressing admiration. Though these gestures did not feed the starving population, they strengthened psychological ties between allies. The Soviet Union needed these symbolic bonds. Before Hitler attacked the USSR, Western distrust of communism was enormous. Propaganda had presented the Soviet state as a totalitarian threat to Europe. The Siege of Leningrad reshaped opinion. Suddenly, Russians appeared as allies fighting the same enemy. Other countries helped indirectly. Canada provided wheat. Australia and India offered medical supplies. South Africa donated food shipments. Latin American governments expressed solidarity, calling Leningrad a heroic city. However, not all assistance succeeded. Proposals involving Red Cross convoys across finish lines collapsed when Germany threatened retaliation. Swedish diplomats attempted to mediate humanitarian corridors, but Hitler refused negotiation. The siege remained sealed. Even so, Allied strategy elsewhere helped Leningrad survive. When Germany redirected resources to Stalingrad, North Africa, and Ukraine, pressure on the Northern Front weakened. Soviet offensives in winter 1943 owed their success partly to German overstretch, created by global Allied conflict. The world indirectly saved Leningrad through combined resistance, not through direct delivery of food. Post-war political climate influenced memory of assistance. Soviet propaganda downplayed Western aid, portraying victory as entirely Soviet-made. Only later historians rebalanced understanding, acknowledging that without Lend-Lease trucks, rail engines, and foodstuffs, Soviet armies might have collapsed, and Leningrad along with them. Thus, Allied assistance, though invisible to many modern readers, formed part of the city's survival structure. It did not break the blockade, but it strengthened every component surrounding it, allowing the Soviet war machine to continue operating long enough to liberate Leningrad from famine and fire. While German forces surrounded Leningrad from the south and west, Finland controlled the northern boundary. The role of Finland in the siege remains controversial because it challenges simplistic interpretations of good and evil. Finland was not driven by Nazi ideology. Its leadership sought to reclaim territories lost to the Soviet Union during the Winter War of 1939-40. Yet Finland's cooperation with Germany enabled the encirclement that starved Leningrad. When Operation Barbarossa began, Finland aligned militarily with Germany, though technically not as formal Axis member. Finnish troops advanced toward the outskirts of Leningrad, retaking Karelia and capturing valuable ground along the Karelian Isthmus. Their artillery could hit parts of the city, though Finnish bombardment was minimal compared to Germany's. Finland made a strategic choice. It stopped its advance at the Svir River and refused to storm Leningrad itself. President Risto Ryti and military leader Carl Gustav Mannerheim believed capturing the city would entangle Finland in genocide. They feared international condemnation and doubted their ability to occupy a metropolis of millions. Yet Finland's refusal to retreat meant the northern half of the blockade stayed intact. Without Finnish participation, the Germans could not have sealed Leningrad completely. This forced every supply channel to flow across Lake Ladoga, a route far more dangerous than land corridors. Finland later negotiated directly with the United States and Britain, insisting it fought only to reclaim Karelia, not to destroy Leningrad. Western diplomats partly believed this. They pressured Finland to leave the war, but Finland argued abandonment would leave it defenseless against Soviet revenge. Thus, Finland remained in position until 1944, effectively acting as blockade wall, even if unintentional. Relations between Finnish soldiers and Leningrad civilians became ghost-like. They never truly met face to face, yet they shaped one another's destinies. Survivors remembered looking north and knowing armies stood there watching. Finnish troops heard rumors of starvation, but rarely saw its consequences because forests and lakes formed natural barriers. Post-war politics nearly erased Finland's memory from the narrative. Soviet history painted Finland as enemy, ignoring internal debates and resistance to German pressure. Modern historians, however, describe Finland's role as morally complex, not genocidal, like Germany, but complicit through inaction. When Finland withdrew in 1944 after Soviet offensives pushed them back, the Northern Ring finally broke. This contributed to full liberation efforts around Leningrad, altering strategic geography and ending the longest siege in modern warfare. Finland's involvement teaches an important lesson. History is rarely binary. Nations can be allies and adversaries simultaneously. Neutrality can become violence through omission, and war forces moral decisions that later generations struggle to judge. January 1944 marked the beginning of the end for the German encirclement of Leningrad. The city had survived 872 days of blockade, more than 2 full years of starvation, freezing nights, psychological collapse, and relentless bombardment. The breaking of the siege was not a sudden miracle. It was the result of carefully constructed Soviet military offensives, huge sacrifices at the front lines, and strategic adjustments that had been building since late 1942. When liberation finally came, it happened with thunder, fire, and forward momentum, an echo of revenge and a roar of resurrection. The Soviet High Command, now stronger than ever after victories at Stalingrad and Kursk, shifted significant troop power to the northern sector. Marshal Leonid Govorov directed the offensive operations, supported by Georgy Zhukov at the strategic level. The Red Army's plan was simple in principle: crush German forces west and south of Leningrad by overwhelming the enemy with artillery and infantry pressure while coordinating advances across swamp, forest, and frozen terrain. Yet the execution was enormously complex. On January 14th, 1944, Soviet artillery opened with one of the largest bombardments of the Northern Front. For 2 hours, the German positions at Yuritsk, Rapsha, and Pushkin were saturated with explosive shells. Survivors later described the earth trembling. Windows rattled inside the starving city. Children awoke to thunder and mistook it for another bombing. But this was a different sound. This was offensive fire, not German attack. For many inside Leningrad, realization came slowly. The Red Army was pushing back. Infantry divisions advanced through knee-deep snow, firing rifles into forest shadows. Soviet tanks, painted white for camouflage, rolled across frozen ground, smashing through German roadblocks. Sappers cleared minefields by crawling forward with metal rods. Air support blasted German trenches. For the first time in years, civilians heard distant explosions and smiled instead of trembling. German resistance was fierce. The Wehrmacht, though weakened and spread thin, had spent years fortifying their positions. Concrete bunkers, anti-tank ditches, and barbed wire mazes slowed Soviet infantry. German units fought in small groups, sniping from trees, hidden bunkers, and shell craters. Many fought to the death because retreat routes were collapsing behind them. Letters recovered from German soldiers showed despair. They wrote of being abandoned by command, surrounded by snow, attacked from sky and ground, and knowing their war in the north was lost. Meanwhile, inside the city, Leningrad's anti-aircraft guns fired celebratory barges. Civilians cheered soldiers marching through neighborhoods. Some kissed the edges of artillery barrels, thanking machines for survival. Hospitals prepared beds for wounded heroes. Radio broadcasts filled the city with triumphant music, announcing that Soviet forces were advancing at every front. On January 18th, the victory became official. Soviet troops recaptured Krasnoye Selo and Rapsha, officially breaking the blockade lines. Stalin ordered nationwide salutes. A 324-gun barrage lit the sky above Moscow. Leningrad residents, too weak to stand for long, still stepped outside to watch smoke trails rising like glowing snakes across the night. The siege was not only broken, German troops were driven into retreat. Over the next weeks, Soviet counteroffensives pushed them back 100 kilometers from the city. Villages once pulverized by artillery saw liberation for the first time in years. Forest bunkers emptied, trenches fell silent, artillery positions lay abandoned. Liberation was not merely strategic, it was emotional. Families walked outside without fear for the first time in years. Schools reopened, rations increased, tram tracks were cleared. Hospitals began treatment programs for extreme malnutrition. Yet liberation also exposed terrible truth. When soldiers walked through rural front lines, they found mass graves, destroyed villages, and frozen bodies under snow. Civilians returning to suburban districts found only fire-blackened foundations where houses once stood. Survivors wandered through ruins, searching for names carved in wood, trying to identify ancestral land. January 1944 was victory, but also grief. Liberation was not the ending of pain, but the beginning of memory. When the siege finally ended, Leningrad resembled a skeletal monument to human endurance. Winter wind blew through glassless windows. Shattered buildings leaned like broken teeth. Tram wires sagged across abandoned tracks. Rubble covered hundreds of streets. Fires from shell impacts had scorched entire districts. Many places were silent except for footsteps echoing against ruined walls. Factories suffered worse damage than anyone expected. Years of bombardment had destroyed large machine halls. Motors lay rusted and frozen. Welding equipment had been moved, stolen, cannibalized for parts, or warped by cold. Shipyards along the Neva held wrecked hulls burned into twisted shapes. Industrial canals were clogged with debris from bombed bridges. Engineers examined furnace rooms and discovered steam boilers cracked beyond repair. Housing conditions bordered on uninhabitable. Public apartments contained broken ovens, cracked walls, frozen plumbing, and destroyed electrical wiring. Workers had to thaw pipes with blowtorches, sometimes exploding sections of wall accidentally. Residents swept frost from bedroom floors every morning. Wallpaper peeled in long rolls. Ceilings dripped condensed breath moisture. Many stairwells were unusable due to collapse or rot. The city also faced environmental debris unimaginable in peaceful times. Parks were filled with makeshift graves. Public squares contained bomb craters large enough to hold houses. Wooden barricades built to resist tanks cluttered streets. Sandbags, barbed wire, ammunition boxes, and anti-aircraft gun mounts covered sidewalks. Removal required thousands of labor hours and specialized machines the city did not yet have. Urban reconstruction demanded military-civil cooperation. Engineers restored tram lines by digging up iron rails and remelting damaged segments. Teams of electrical specialists strung new wires across frozen rooftops to restart lighting grids. Hospitals reopened slowly, sterilizing rooms, replacing shattered windows, and ordering new medical equipment from distant factories. Transportation infrastructure took priority. Without proper highways, food deliveries remained slow and painful. Soviet authorities repaired bridges, cleared roads of snowdrifts, and rebuilt destroyed rail yards. New trains soon arrived, carrying not only supplies but hope. Rebuilding also exposed trauma. Workers clearing debris discovered human bones in burned rooms. Mass grave pits had to be relocated into organized cemeteries. Officials cataloged tens of thousands of unidentified remains, one of the most emotionally difficult administrative tasks in world history. Cultural reconstruction became symbolic of rebirth. The Hermitage Museum reopened exhibition halls. Curators uncrated paintings evacuated years earlier, hanging masterpieces on walls still scorched by artillery heat. Music halls reopened, and orchestras rehearsed in buildings with patched roofs and cracked floors. Libraries cataloged books that survived being burned for fuel, preserving them for future generations. Rebuilding also reshaped architecture. Rather than restore every palace to imperial detail, Soviet planners redesigned districts into modern socialist housing zones. Large apartment blocks rose from empty lots. New hospitals, theaters, and schools appeared. Yet the city kept its historical center intact. St. Isaac's Cathedral, Winter Palace, Admiralty Spire, and bridges were repaired with extraordinary care. Economically, rebuilding brought jobs. Former soldiers became construction workers. Women who welded tank armor during the war now welded steel beams into new housing frameworks. Teenagers hauled bricks. Engineers invented snow-melting pipelines to speed labor. But behind physical success lay psychological wounds. Residents struggled to live near buildings where their families had died. Entire neighborhoods contained trauma markers. A bakery where rations were bombed, an apartment block where families starved together, a courtyard used as execution site by artillery. Some citizens refused to live in certain districts forever. Reconstruction took more than a decade, but slowly, Leningrad transformed again from a starving, dying fortress into a breathing, rebuilt city. Tourists eventually returned. Restaurants reopened. Universities filled with new generations of students. Trams clanged along Nevsky Prospect again. Rebuilding did not erase the siege, it preserved it. The city was not restored to pretend nothing happened. It was restored to prove survival. The end of the blockade did not end moral debate. How should a nation remember starvation? How do survivors live with memories of their dead? Should the world treat the siege as military victory or humanitarian atrocity? These questions shaped the post-war decades. Immediately after liberation, the Soviet government framed the siege as symbol of communist strength. Official ceremonies honored Red Army generals, factory workers, and cultural figures. Newspapers praised Stalin. Public statues of heroic soldiers appeared. Streets were renamed after battles. Yet beneath national pride lay private grief. Survivors carried memories of cannibalism, ration theft, body disposal, and emotional numbness. Many stayed silent, fearing social shame or political punishment. Soviet culture discouraged open discussion of starvation. The government wished to highlight glory, not trauma. Over time, however, psychological truth emerged. Writers published novels about hunger. Diarists shared childhood memories. Museum exhibitions displayed ration cards and diary fragments. Scholars interviewed survivors, recording emotional testimony. Tanya Savacheva's diary became centerpiece of global remembrance. Justice also entered conversation. Historians examined German documents proving Hitler intended genocide of Leningrad. This evidence reframed the siege not as typical military operation, but as crime against humanity. Some modern scholars label it planned city extermination. The post-siege decades also saw creation of memorial landscapes. The most powerful is Piskaryovskoye Cemetery, where nearly 500,000 civilians and soldiers rest. Visitors walk in silence along mass burial mounds. Eternal flame burns. The plaque reads, "No one is forgotten, nothing is forgotten." St. Petersburg citizens visit the site every January when the city commemorates Siege Memorial Day. They carry flowers, candles, and photographs. Schools teach lessons about the blockade. Families recount war stories at dinner tables. Post-Soviet documentaries and digital archives now preserve recordings, diaries, maps, and interviews. Survivors who lived into the 21st century continued to shape memory politics. Some demanded full recognition of Soviet mistakes. Late evacuations, unequal rations, special elite treatment. Others opposed criticism, insisting such debates dishonored fallen heroes. The truth, as always, lies between extremes. Internationally, the Siege of Leningrad became symbol of universal human endurance. Museums worldwide display Soviet uniforms, diaries, and photographs. Holocaust and genocide scholars study the siege because it illuminates mass starvation as weapon. Modern St. Petersburg bears physical marks of memory. Bronze plaques mark houses bombed. Museums preserve ruin walls. Monuments line embankments. Even the city's silence on snowy mornings, when the wind resembles artillery echoes, feels like memorial language. Today, students debate siege ethics. Could more lives have been saved? Was sacrifice necessary? Should evacuation have begun earlier? Should propaganda have admitted truth sooner? Should the world have intervened? The answers remain complex. But what is certain? The siege changed human understanding of suffering and endurance. It proved a city could survive starvation through unity of spirit. It proved that culture, love, music, and identity could stand against death. The legacy stretches far beyond Russia. Every nation touched by war sees Leningrad as a reminder. Civilians pay highest price in conflict, and hunger kills silently more than bullets ever will. 3 generations after liberation, Leningrad lives on, not only in buildings and statues, but in global conscience. The city endured 872 days of terror, emerged with identity that transformed forever. Today's St. Petersburg is living evidence that history can wound deeply and yet heal into strength. The moral of this story: human beings are capable of surviving the unimaginable when they fight together. Leningrad teaches us that courage is not only on battlefields. It lives in ordinary people who refuse to give up, even when the world around them falls apart. Some parts of this history were painful to hear, but remembering them honors those who never lived to speak again. Their silence became our responsibility. And now, as we close this chapter, remember, history shapes who we are, and stories like this remind us why we must protect peace. If you felt connected, inspired, shocked, educated, or moved, return to this History channel. Here, history is not dates and numbers. It is life, blood, memory, and emotion. More powerful stories are coming. Ancient wars, lost empires, forgotten heroes, dark tragedies, hidden truths of humanity. Subscribe, share this journey, and join me again, because the past is never dead. It is waiting for you in the next video. Thank you for watching. Until our next time,